Hello and welcome everybody to another exciting episode of Side Talks 2.0. As always, my name is Dr. Jack Saxenian. Um, as you guys know, I've been doing a lot of YouTube videos about various topics related to science and medicine, and I've been covering a lot about the pandemic. Today, I have an exciting show for all of you. We will be having a debate and a discussion about the ongoing pandemic and with a infectious disease doctor, Dr. Melikian. And so this is bound to be a very exciting interactive video session with all of you. So throughout this, please make your comments as we will be taking comments from the audience and including them in our discussion and our debates. For those of you who are on Facebook, please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel at SciTalks 2.0, as in the future, I'll be mainly using my YouTube Live to be able to do these kinds of events. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button on SciTalks 2.0. Another quick announcement before we get started with today's show is that, as most of you know, I've published a digital composite book that is available on Amazon for you guys to order. Proceeds from this sale will be donated to a COVID cause, a charity that's involved in helping out with the ongoing pandemic. So if you guys could go on there and order, there's also the digital copy for EPUB, but the hard book is sometimes preferable as you want to have these beautiful images in your hand. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm also currently working on a second book called The Antenna Theory of Human Consciousness. This is about how we could combine quantum mechanics and physics to understand the underlying mechanisms of how we think and how the brain works and how consciousness is made. So please look forward to this book in the future, and I will let you guys know when this is available to be ordered. So with that, I will bring in the two guests, Levon Baronian, who will be sort of the moderator of this debate, discussion topic, whatever you guys want to call it, and Dr. Melikian, who's an infectious disease doctor, and will be the one that I will be debating with. So with that, let me bring in Levon Baronian and Dr. George Melikian. Welcome, guys. As you guys saw, the quick introduction, I'll turn this over to Levon, who will kind of be running the show to talk about the logistics and what we're here and introduce Dr. Melikian and myself, and we'll go from there. So, Levon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me, guys, as your moderator. I'm surrounded here with two very prestigious and knowledgeable gentlemen, and I'm going to try to do my best to kind of balance the discussion to kind of give both of you guys an equal opportunity to make your points, share the information that you have that you've acquired throughout the years as part of your profession, as part of your expertise. Obviously, the topic is coronavirus, COVID-19, and the slew of associated issues with it. So I'm going to try to give you guys some tough questions. I'm not going to go easy on you guys, but my basic goal is to be fair and balanced and give you guys equal time and opportunity. Both of you guys are my friends. I've known each of you for many years. Jack introduced himself a little bit. Dr. Jack Saxenian is an MD PhD. He's a physician scientist with a specialty in endovascular neurology. I have to admit, I don't know exactly what that is, but it sounds very, very impressive. As far as Dr. George Melikian, he's also an MD, MPH, and he's a board certified physician specializing in infectious diseases and internal medicine. He's also a medical director and a professional statistician. So I look forward to this very, very interesting discussion. I don't want to call it a debate, but at some point, let's have a debate because I know you guys agree on a lot of things, but disagree on some others. So let's get this started, guys. Huh?
Okay, nice. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you, Levon.
All right, let's get ready to roll.
Before we go on, does somebody have YouTube, their Facebook on or something like that? Because I could hear reverberations in the background. No? Okay. All right, cool.
No,
No. Okay.
is it
All
from
right.
me?
I don't, Levon, Can you
I
hear
don't have
that when I'm?
anything. I don't have anything open.
Okay.
I don't
All
have
right.
anything open either.
Okay. Cool. Let's get started.
All right, guys. So let's do this. We want to wrap this up by 9 o'clock, so that we don't take too much of people's time because I'm sure you guys can talk for several hours about this topic. So I'm going to try to limit each person's response to about 2 minutes, and give you guys.
Levon, I think your voice is a little bit reverberating. George, are you able to hear him? Okay.
It's reverberating a little bit. You're right.
Is it
Yeah.
just me?
Yeah. When you talk, it looks like there's reverberations.
A little bit.
Let's see. Do I have Facebook open maybe here somewhere? Let's see. I don't. All right. Well, I'm not going to be doing much talking, so you guys are going to have to bear with me.
Okay, no problem.
Let's start off with hot topic today.
Why don't I take you off and then bring you back in?
Okay.
Let's try that again.
Now you're echoing.
Okay.
Oh, okay, we're good.
We're good. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. All right, guys. Let's start off with hydroxychloroquine. It's been the news quite a bit lately. What are your thoughts on this? Is this an effective drug? Is this something that's worth pursuing? I'm going to start with Jack on this topic. I know his thoughts on it, but I'd like to hear what he thinks about hydroxychloroquine and whether it should be prescribed.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm still hearing reverberations, and I think the audience says that maybe we should put on headphones so that it doesn't do that, but I'm not sure if that'll solve the problem. I don't think we had an issue earlier when we were all chatting, so
You sound totally fine to me here.
yeah, you're okay? Levon, are you listening? Are you hearing me okay? Okay, let me. Okay.
One thing that maybe we should do is when we're not talking, let's do that.
Okay. All right. So as you guys saw me debating Levon last time, and we were talking about hydroxychloroquine, my thoughts on that is that we don't have enough clinical data to support the use of hydroxychloroquine. In terms of clinical data, I just want to quickly let the audience know the type of studies that are being done and what value and weight that each of these have in terms of um, their importance and the information that they give us. So at the bottom of the pyramid, which means the one that has the least evidence, is what we call case reports. This is when somebody does something on one or two patients and reports their findings. These have the least value in terms of supporting any kind of data, right? Then we have what are called, and again, I'm really going to simplify this. We have retrospective clinical trials. That's where you go look back in the patient charts and say, based on the patient charts, those who got a drug versus the ones that didn't, what was the outcome, right? So this is a retrospective study. In other words, you go back and then you say, let's look at the ones that got the drug and the ones that didn't. What was the outcome, right? Now, the problem with these kinds of studies is that you can only make correlations. You can't really talk about causation because there could be confounding factors which influences the outcome, right? So the example I like to give is that imagine somebody wants to study why there's higher number of children that die in the summer. Again, this is just an example. And what they find is that, oh my God, in the summer, kids that die, there's a higher incidence of those kids eating ice cream, right? But that's a false claim because it's not the ice cream that's causing the death. It's that in the summer it's hot, therefore kids swim more and therefore they die more, right? They have more drownings. So to connect it to eating ice cream tells you that it's a confounder that affects the way you essentially analyze the outcome. So retrospective studies have this inherent weakness to them, and therefore there's not a lot of value that's put on there. It gives you information that should be used to later build your story. Now the gold standard for
Thanks,
these
Jack.
is the prospective randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials. That's where you say, okay, I found an effect, let's give the drug to half the patients, let's give placebo to the other half, and let's see what the outcome is. In this case, you're only controlling one variable and you're studying the outcome. This is why we put all that effort into clinical trials that are randomized placebo controlled. Now, the reason I'm saying all of this is that in the context of hydroxychloroquine, so far all the data that has shown any benefit or any kind of effect have been retrospective clinical trials. And again, I told you about the inherent weaknesses of these. But the couple that was done in terms of a randomized controlled trial have shown no effects, right? And we could get into a little bit of the specifics of this, but none of them have shown any effect. Now, some of them have shown actually causing arrhythmias and stuff, but I don't want to go into the side effects because we've been using this drug for quite some time. So the side effects can be controlled, the adverse events, right? Now, the other issue is that when we look at adverse events, when we just give it to people that have rheumatoid arthritis or SLE or lupus, it's not the whole population. So if we start expanding to the number of people we're giving this drug, that even if it's a small percent of people that have an adverse effect, if you multiply a small number by a big number, you're going to get a big number, right? So far, I would say that all the trials have shown that there is no effect, the ones that were done properly, and the ones that have given any sort of hint are the ones that are retrospective studies. The one I want to mention is the Henry Ford study that came out and that was very popular on TV. Everybody was talking about it, where they say they looked at thousands of patients. So that seems to make it more valuable, right? But if you look at the study, it's actually a retrospective study. So I gave you the caveats for that. And not only that, majority of the people in the hydroxychloroquine group ended up getting steroids, right? So what is the problem with getting steroids? It's not a problem. It's that steroids work, especially in the really sick population. So if you give steroids,
just kind of
yeah.
summarize it?
So I'm just saying this study had that inherent issue as well in terms of having steroids on top of the fact that it was a retrospective study. So
Okay, thanks, Dr. Jack. So a couple things there, and we're going to give Dr. George the opportunity to present his thoughts on hydroxychloroquine. But one of the things that you alluded to was that there were kind of studies done after the fact, and these are correlative studies. How do you go against, when you can kind of address this, how do you go against doctors actually seeing this in the field? How do you tell doctors to only give it to a portion of their patients and not all of them? I mean, at the end of the day, doctors have a Hippocratic oath, and if they firmly believe that they should, that this medicine actually treats a particular illness, how do they only give that to a portion of their patients and not others? But anyways, let's listen to Dr. George's thoughts on the matter of hydroxychloroquine.
Okay. I'm off mute, right? Okay. So a few points here, Jack. I don't mean to, the thing about, you're wrong on one of these issues. Retrospective studies they're not just about correlation. You could look at the same children prospectively, and you'll see that they're having the ice cream during the summer. It doesn't change that part of the equation. What retrospective studies are really fall victim to is bias. There's all sorts of reasons when you look backwards that maybe somebody got a treatment, or somebody gave that person a treatment, or somebody showed up at a hospital. All these things that looking backwards, we have the benefit of that you can't assume they're totally random. Whereas if you just follow a group of 100 random people and see what happens to them forward in time, you're presumably balance out that noise. Now, the thing with COVID-19, I understand your point. It's true. There's been studies that are mixed, but I want to point out one thing that's important here is that this infection is very complex. It's not what we're used to, what we're used to as far as other infections go. The reason I say that is even medications that we know that work, for example, remdesivir, they only have a window of time where they're effective, beyond which they don't work or they could be harmful. So, for example, trial on remdesivir versus placebo, when it was given to patients who are already intubated, or if I recall, even on very high flow oxygen, it was basically indistinguishable from placebo. The discovery trial that looked at the use of steroids. Now, this is a big issue now that steroids seem to work Now, use of steroids has been debated with like influenza and the past other infections because one
And
of
not
the
to
things.
cut you off, George, but even didn't China initially, when the pandemic started, they said they did a trial with steroids and they found no effect and it was actually doing harm, and that's why initially we weren't using steroids.
That is correct. That's part of it. Well, there's a number of reasons with steroids that we have to be careful. It lowers the immune system. It causes fluid retention, and this is the process when people really get sick and die of COVID. It's late in the disease, and they go into this inflammatory storm. The body basically fills up with fluid. The lungs fill up with fluid. At that point, it's really not the virus anymore that's killing you. It's your own body that's killing you. It's your body's response to the virus that's killing you. That's why killing the virus at that point doesn't even make a difference anymore, because it's a runaway like a runaway reaction that just goes on and on. So what I was trying to say earlier with the steroids, for example, there was concern about that in previous studies that we've shown with influenza, for example, that steroids actually increases the amount of virus people shed when they're on steroids. And the discovery trial, if you look at the data from that trial, which was very useful, it showed a huge benefit to steroids, but only if it was started late. And late as in people needed to be on oxygen either minimally or up to being intubated for it to work. The opposite of what remdesivir did, and that's really because, like I said, people at that point are starting. It's the inflammatory system, and that's going bananas, and you're giving steroids to control that. Now, if you look at that data from the discovery trial, you'll find that people who got steroids before they were on oxygen, when they had no need for oxygen, if they gave them steroids, there's actually a shift towards harm. It wasn't statistically significant, but it was close. It was getting there. It was enough that it's concerning. The reason I'm saying this, Jack, is because I think that we have to, hydroxychloroquine, when people talk about it as if it's okay, it's just one drug. You give it, like you have a cold and you take it. I think the important part is where in the disease process is it used. Now, we don't have all the data. There's, the Henry Ford study. I was going to bring up that paper because there was the people who got the hydroxychloroquine also got steroids. They also happen to be sicker in that paper. The other area where it hasn't really been evaluated is the use of steroids, the use of hydroxychloroquine for prophylaxis, pre-exposure prophylaxis. That's an area that hasn't been meshed out. The last thing I wanted to say, I won't belabor this point, but I think that we have data on the safety of hydroxychloroquine. I'm holding a nice summary of the hydroxychloroquine studies here with just COVID alone. The safety it's very safe. I mean, in one study, for example, the risk of QT prolongation, which is the main thing we worry about, was I think it was 0.17%. It was under 1%. People had that complication. So if we know something is safe and there's a possibility that it could be helpful, this may be useful, particularly in countries, for example, in places like, Armenia, places where you don't have access to remdesivir. What do you say to those people? Or what if somebody doesn't have access to any more of these fancier, more expensive drugs? I think it's something that needs more investigation. I'm not saying it's a hole-in-one, it works 100%, but I think it deserves a little bit more study.
Thank you, George. So and please let's try to mute ourselves when we're not speaking. You guys presented a lot of great information, and both of you guys are obviously doctors and specialists in your perspectives. So, I don't want to discount any of that stuff, but maybe let's try to kind of speak a little bit more in layman's terms, just so that the average viewer can kind of understand a little bit more. Some of these technical terms, we're probably gonna have a hard time understanding. Second thing is probably try to keep your answers shorter so that we can give an opportunity to go back and forth. So, what I heard is that Dr. Jack is against the use of hydroxychloroquine for treating COVID. He's outright against it, whereas Dr. George believes that it should still be considered and kind of looked at and potentially could be useful. And there is some data that's,
So Jack, are you saying that it's definitive that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work? That's scientific fact?
No, so I need to clarify the way Levin presented it, because I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm saying there's no data supporting that it works right now. right? I
Okay,
know.
stop for a second, Jack. George, can you refute that?
No, of course I could refute that. I mean, the data is mixed. The data
But
is
there's no data I mean clinical trial data that shows, I mean, outside of the retrospective ones we talked about with its caveats, that it actually is beneficial. In fact, in terms of pre-exposure or prophylaxis data, there was one that came out of India that when they, again, it was a retrospective study looking at healthcare people that were exposed to COVID, and they were looking at a bunch of parameters, and one of them was whether they took
I think that was
hydroxychloroquine.
post exposure.
No, this was pre-exposure, and they were take. So these are healthcare workers that were taking the drug, and there were ones that weren't, and they looked at if they took for 7 days or 10 days, right? And they actually found that there is no significant difference, and in fact, the ones that were taking the drug, they were wearing more masks. So
Okay, guys,
any
let me
benefit?
let me let me let me cut you guys off here for a second. Just yes or no question. I want to get clear answer on this. Your own patient doesn't have too many options. Would you prescribe hydroxychloroquine to them to treat them? I know you guys are doctors and you have liability issues and whatnot, but just from a purely kind of we're talking right now. It's a discussion. This shouldn't be considered medical advice. But would each of you prescribe or give hydroxychloroquine to your patients? Yes or no, Jack?
If that's a loaded question because it depends on the situation of the patient. If the patient
Under any
is,
circumstances,
well, it depends. If they're really, really sick,
would you ever give them hydroxychloroquine?
Would you
uh,
ever?
I don't see the point of it. So I would say
Okay.
no.
Okay. How about
Never,
you?
ever.
Well,
I would, yeah.
unless new data comes
That's
out,
my opinion, no, absolutely.
that shows pre-exposure or prophylactic
All right, guys.
situations, or
I mean,
even
I don't
mild
want to
case.
beat this point down too much because obviously, you're on different kind of viewpoints on this. So I just wanted to hear that because I have to admit, as somebody that's not a doctor, if I was offered hydroxychloroquine, I take it, and I look at data too all day. That's my profession. I'm a computer scientist. I literally study data. That's my job.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that there are other things that these patients could be receiving. In fact, most of them could get better without even taking any medications if they're young and they're healthy.
That's fine.
Majority recover by
That's
themselves.
that's a separate
It's a
point.
So
separate
so
topic.
so then how do you
But
pick and
you
choose
can't
which?
wait. I mean, what you're trying to say is you're waiting for the most perfectly designed, prospective randomized clinical trial to make a choice on a medication that, by the way, has been up in the market for years, for many years. We
Yeah,
know the
but
safety
George,
profile. It's not,
but
it's not chemotherapy. We know what it does. At the very worst, it doesn't work, or at the very worst, it has a side effect profile of what we know it to be. One last thing, Jack. I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
no.
The other thing is, you were saying that the people who take hydroxychloroquine currently are people with rheumatoid arthritis. Actually, these folks are generally sicker than the rest of the population. They have a compromised immune system. So that actually, it kind of, if they're doing okay with it, the chances of healthy people, taking it, having a bad reaction is significantly less.
Very
But
good point.
we have data on that.
No,
Very
but
good
I
point.
mean,
These are
it's not
sick
the
people.
immune system component we're worried about. It's the cardiac issues and the QT prolongation that could give heart attack and torsades. That's the issue. It's not about the immune system. And you know that the study from, I think he's from Cedars, I forgot his name, that looked back on his patients that had lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and wanted to see if there's any difference. And he didn't find anything that's significant, right? So patients taking it had no difference. And
But,
so
but
that tells, and again, it's a retrospective study. I could argue that, retrospective studies are not strong. So I could say that, well, that study is a retrospective. So you can't take the results of it. I understand.
so I think what's important to note here is that there really isn't a medical consensus that hydroxychloroquine isn't absolutely safe. Like there's certain cases where it is seen to be improving the state of patients' health and kind of improving their diagnosis. So I
It's
think
not first
There
line.
isn't.
It's not first line medication. But
yeah,
what we're saying is, if there's no other options left, I wouldn't let somebody die. If this is what I'm worried about is QT versus somebody dying.
okay.
I agree.
Guys,
I agree. Like,
let's kind of wrap up the hydroxychloroquine because we still have a lot of stuff to talk about, and this
but
is
but
all.
can I make one point? is
Sure.
that politicizing this is the worst thing that could happen on both ends of it, because at the end of the day these arguments and discussions should be had by physicians and scientists, people running the clinical trials. And I don't mean to belittle the public, but having discussions that this is politically driven should be left out of the medical arena, and we should be doing the science one way or another. I was a big proponent of hydroxychloroquine, and I still think under the right circumstances, if the trials are done correctly. And that's my also other frustration, is that people keep doing the same stuff that's wrong. Why don't we do it the right way? Why did they cancel the actual randomized clinical trials that Europe was running? I wanted that to finish. Then I think that was the biggest mistake. Let's finish that and see what the outcome is. And therefore I feel like
Okay.
we're doing a disfavor to humanity by not doing the right experiments.
All right,
Okay.
guys.
Next topic.
Yeah, guys, and let's try to stay a little bit more concise because we only have about 30, 35 more minutes left, and we have quite a bit of topics to discuss. I know you guys are subject matter experts and can talk about any one of these things for hours, but let's try to stay within a couple minutes and have the chance to respond. Schools. This is something that's very important to me as a parent. I have three very young children, and obviously schools in California, for the most part, are shut down for the state's orders, and there's thresholds that have been set for what coronavirus positivity cases or positivity needs to be in the general population before schools could open. I want to hear your guys' opinions on whether it's actually safe to open schools, and if so, under what types of circumstances, and if not, then when would it be safe? And I'm going to give this question first to Dr. George.
Well, so that's an interesting topic, or interesting question, because the the answer is mixed, right? I mean, we all know. So there's tons of data showing so far. Well, not tons, I should say, but a great deal of data that shows that children are. Well, we know for sure that children are not at risk for having bad outcomes. They do very, very well. The risk of dying from coronavirus is very, very small. The question that's not entirely clear is whether they can transmit it to adults. And if you open the school, that's what, and other children is what we worry about. And the children come home and they give it to their parents. So that's a little background on the question. Up to just about a week ago, I was really, really gung ho about opening the schools straight out and letting them do it. We have data from Sweden, we have Denmark, some other countries, Israel as well. But then there's a couple recent sort of studies or outbreaks that have kind of changed the situation a little bit, or at least left. You have to be, yeah, I mean, you have to always listen to the data and think about it. I think that's what good science is. So I'll cut to the chase. And there's a camping trip outbreak. You probably heard about that, right, Jack? There's a camping trip outbreak where these kids were, they had several cases of coronavirus, and it just spread like wildfire among these kids. These were, I think, 12 to 14-year-old kids.
Yeah, the one in
The
Georgia.
Georgia one, yeah. The CDC reported on that. That's really concerning. There's another paper that was published in. There's two papers. One was in JAMA. One was talking about immunoglobulin levels viral load levels, the amount of virus in children, that it's very high. That is a little bit more up for debate. The significance of that is not, because we're talking about the immune system. So that's where I stand. I think it requires a little bit more study. It's just peculiar, I got to say, that this far along into the epidemic, we're still not seeing. We should be seeing more data showing that children are spreading this all over the place. Because every other type of infectious disease, especially respiratory viruses, children are the drivers of that. All you have to do is be around the child. You see they're constantly, wiping their nose, touching things, doing, things that we don't do. But we haven't seen that sort of trend, which is really strange. But go ahead, Jack.
I agree with you that we have to be very cautious and have the data kind of lead us the way. And in some ways, I do agree that there were a lot more studies showing that it's safe to be around children. Let me put it to you that way, that they're not going to pass it on. But even the study that just came out of Italy, where they looked at 64,000 people, I think I shared it with you yesterday. It hasn't been published, but it is published in Italian. It hasn't been translated into English yet. And within that, they looked at how rapidly the children were able to pass it on to the elderly, and they found a high transmission rate amongst children to the elderly. So that's the first study that I've seen that has shown some level of, hey, we need to stop and think about whether children can pass it on. And so the question is not about the kids getting sick, it's about creating an environment where they'll be passing it on to the teacher, or they'll pick it up, come home, and give it to um, their family members. Now, there's been multiple different models created about like different ways of opening up the school. One of them is the hybrid system, where you go to school for 2 days and then you stop and then go back 2 days later. So you're kind of shifting the classes. I think that's even a more dangerous model that some people are proposing, the hybrid model. It's because you're increasing the bubble in terms of the number of contacts you're having. So I'd rather have kids, if we're going to open the school and if there's districts who decide, have them all be in the same time, because you're decreasing the number of contacts, and therefore the chances of it spreading like wildfire is going to be a lot worse. The other issue that I have is that I don't believe most schools are prepared. I have all the resources to be able to screen for symptoms, screen for kids that are sick, and be able to send them home. Who's going to be doing this? And we know in the winter time, most parents lie about their kid being sick because they don't want to pick them up from school, right? So who's going to do all of this? And the last thing that I wanted to say is that I it's kind of hard to put it, but we should be waiting for other countries and see what the outcomes are before we start opening. And we also can't compare it directly, because we have to look at the prevalence of the virus within that community. If the prevalence is low, then maybe we could consider it. So I don't think this should be a national choice. It should be local within each district, that the decision of how to open the school and how to go about it should be made. And we may have to stagger these. We may open it, see how it's going, and then pull back and slow it down and turn the schools off. So I don't think there's going to be a one solution answer to this. It's going to be complicated, and we need the right leadership at the district level, the school level, to be able to do contact tracing, to be able to catch these people that are sick, send them to home, and be able to figure out how many people got infected. And we need more rapid testing, because this will be the only way where I could feel comfortable saying, let's open the schools.
Let me ask a follow-up question about this, and just real quick, I want to kind of, in a minute, if you guys can explain this to me at least. So, from what we've understood thus far, this virus has already been known about since what, late December officially, maybe sooner now. I mean, maybe sooner, because certain things came out saying that it might have actually been around sooner. So, if this was actually if it came out in December, as early reports suggested, the first shutdowns in the United States happened in about mid-March. Okay, so assuming that this virus is actually as contagious as we think it is, that's 2.5 months there where this virus could have potentially spread unmitigated. Schools were open until about March 15th. How come we didn't see a big kind of spread and a lot of people dying? I mean, sure, we weren't testing for it, and some might argue that the more you test, the more positive cases you're going to find because you're testing for it. One of the things that I brought up with our debate, Jack, is that we've tested about 70 million times now for coronavirus in the United States, whereas annually we test only about 70,000 times for the flu. So if you test, 1,000 times more, you're going to naturally have more positives. So can you guys explain to me what, if this virus is so contagious, how come it wasn't spreading, and how come people weren't dropping dead on the streets and being really, really sick in the first 2.5 months of this year? If it's contagious, it should have spread, right?
But it did. I mean, that peak that you see from mid-March or wherever, when it went up and then came back down, that's a classic epidemic curve, Levon. So it was spreading. It just takes a while for it to take hold, to propagate. But we're talking about the schools. I would say that I think generally what we do is we quarantine those that are infected, and we quarantine those that are at risk. Children are not at risk, and in my opinion, I think one of the things we should consider is send the kids to school. If you have classrooms, with 20, 24-year-olds, 23, 24-year-olds acting as teachers, or teachers who are zooming in, I think that's generally. I mean, that's a pretty safe option given the risk. It's actually a very, very small chance. The question is, there's nothing that's 100% safe. There's nothing that we can come up with that's going to come out with no transmission. But we have to also.
Never have we done that in the past? I mean, right? I mean, the flu kills thousands of children per year. We never tried to kind of stop schools, or when flu season was at its peak. So that's kind of what the average layperson is asking today. Why is the response to this different than the flu, which actually kills children? Whereas in the state of California, thank goodness, thank God, no children have actually, succumbed to this illness.
It's not about the children, Levon. It's about them passing it on to the more vulnerable population, right? And causing a local outbreak, community outbreak that if we don't have the proper testing and fast enough and rapid enough response, it could lead to a really rapid outbreak. And I,
But
I
we
don't
have
think
data from Europe, though. We have data from Europe. We have data from Sweden, which is, sure, they had a per capita higher rate of cases than we did at one point, but those are also up for question because they have different population densities there. But look at their curve now, and they didn't stop anything. They didn't stop their economy. They didn't shut anything down, and now they're basically down to zero. The other day, they had 0 new deaths, actually.
All right, guys,
well,
quick yes or no question. And obviously, there's a lot of caveats here. So I know there's not a yes or a no, but with caveats, uh, Dr. Jack, should schools reopen next week? Is there any circumstance under which schools should reopen next week?
they can open remotely, yes.
No, I'm talking about in-person instruction.
I would not be in favor of it for the fall quarter or semester, as they call it.
Okay. How about you, Dr. George? Is there any circumstance under which you would be okay with schools opening up for in-person instruction soon?
Absolutely. I would do it step by step. I would start with opening up kindergartens, and then having people look at what kind of who they have at home, if they're living in multi-generational households or not, if they want to basically ease the process in. But we have to move forward. We have to do it safely, but we have to move forward. I am very reassured, though, by the data coming in from Europe. We're not the first ones on the planet trying to do this. It makes. I mean, it really goes a long way to say that to know that all these countries, for example, that we're talking about, Sweden, Denmark, Israel, they've gone through this and they've generally come out okay. There's been a few outbreaks, but they've done okay.
But George, I do want to mention that prevalence of the virus within those areas were a lot lower than what we are in certain parts of the country right now. So I would agree with that only if we were able to control it within each region and bring it down to a level that's reasonable to be accepted, right? So I don't think to say all schools should open, like places like Arizona, Florida, and Texas, like a week or two ago. If you had opened it there, it would cause.
Well, Jack, I wanted to ask you guys, clear question. I said, are there any circumstances under which you think that schools should open next week or soon? And you said no. And so you think that right now there's no circumstance, no type of situation under which any schools should open.
I mean, if we were able to control the virus and have a vaccine in like 2 months, I'm all for it.
Come on now.
I mean, well, he asked me for a circumstance. I'm giving him a circumstance.
Okay, great.
So
that's another thing that I wanted to get into. So, Jack, you and I discussed this too. Vaccines have come up a lot as one of the things that are going to mitigate this virus, that are going to bring it into control. I know, and I'm not a doctor, that the flu vaccine, for example, has only an effectiveness of about 30 to 40%. And that's for the people that actually take the flu shot, which is about a third of the population, if that. So in reality, the flu vaccine only applies to about 10% in terms of its preventiveness. So why do we think that vaccines are necessarily going to be the savior for us when it comes to coronavirus? And why do we need to wait for vaccines, or should we wait for vaccines to be able to start opening up? Jack, since you were talking about vaccines, I'll give you the first opportunity to talk about that.
I think vaccines, even if they're not 100% effective, are going to provide us with enough effective immunity and protection where, well, I'm assuming the virus, let's assume the vaccine works, right? Well, I mean, of course, we need to test these, but so far all the data has shown that it's effective in the early stages of the clinical trials. Now, again, I'm going to hold my skepticism.
Jack, would you mandate people getting vaccines? Can you mandate people getting vaccines?
This is more of a philosophical question that I don't agree with anybody forcing anything on anybody. you should be given the choice. Would I highly recommend it? Absolutely, right? But I don't think people should be mandated to inject anything inside their body. I would recommend it, and I would 100% support it and encourage it and do everything I can to make people understand how the vaccine works, what's the mechanism behind it, so that they understand what they're injecting inside their body and what the importance of it is, right?
Dr.
But I
George,
would not have any mandates for sure.
what's your opinion on the waiting for this vaccine as the savior for us for coronavirus? I mean, obviously you guys are both physicians and you obviously are not anti-vax people, so we're not even going to
No,
go
no,
there.
no, I'm not anti-vax, but I think people probably don't know, or maybe some know, the technology used in this vaccine. This is called an mRNA vaccine. This is a type of vaccine that's never been used before. It's brand new. It operates in a completely different way. You essentially Leon, it's kind of like what you do. You write the code for the vaccine. You design it by computer, which is what they design the mRNA sequence. Then your body takes that RNA and it makes a protein itself. That is something that your immune system will recognize as foreign, and then you're counting on that to work. I hope it works. I'm not saying it's definitely not going to work, but I think we have to be very skeptical. And on top of, and I think what you were alluding to, Levon, that we have to have buy-in from the population. Enough people have to get vaccinated for this to even work. No vaccine is anywhere near even 50, 60%. I mean, vaccines generally, they're hit and miss. So I'm not putting all my eggs in the basket of the vaccine. I think that and we know this actually in infectious disease, the most durable immunity is natural immunity. There's this thing called viral interference. It's this concept called viral interference. That is, when somebody gets infected with a certain virus, like for example with influenza, this isn't theory, this is fact. When they fight it off naturally, they develop actually immunity to a whole bunch of other viruses that the body has never even seen before. It's been studied. It's been documented. This isn't storytelling. So that's the best type of immunity to develop in a population. With something like this, if you ask me, with an infection that has such a favorable profile for children, definitely I think we should not really worry about the kids getting sick and all this kind of stuff. There are some small cases we have to be careful, but to step back and not put all our reliance on a vaccine, though, and let herd immunity do some of the lifting.
Yeah, and there were reports just I think last week that came out, which was interesting for me at least, in hearing that apparently some people already have some measure of immunity to this virus that have never obviously had it. They haven't been exposed to COVID, but for different reasons, and some were speculating that it might be because of exposure to previous strains of coronaviruses that their bodies have an immune response to this. What can you guys tell us about that?
I could quickly answer that. So that's actually something that's floating around. There's lots of data. It's not randomized, clinical trial type data.
By the way, I'm in favor of that concept of cross-reactivity, just to put that out there. And this is why I wasn't initially scared of the virus, but my mind changed. Sorry, George, go on.
No, very brief. There's been several papers in leading journals. In Nature, there was 2 papers, for example, where when they looked at the immunologic profiles of people who'd had COVID and didn't have COVID, and they found exactly what you're talking about. A lot of them, which is immunity or antibodies that worked against samples of coronavirus 19. They also showed that these folks had antibodies to other coronaviruses. There's one called Netherlands 63, NL63 strain. This strain came out, I think, in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. It's a very harmless strain. It's completely harmless, and it attaches to the same receptor as this one does, this COVID-19. So it makes functional sense that if somebody fought that off and developed immunity to it, that there may be some cross-reactivity.
But again, just a quick point that having antibodies doesn't necessarily mean like full immunity, because we're understanding that even when we use the serological measures of antibodies to say what % of people are actually, let's say, immune to it, I think that's also a kind of an understatement and an underestimation, because we know the T cell arm of that, not to get too detailed, but the other branch of the immune system also plays an important role in fighting off this infections, particularly COVID-19. So I think we need a better understanding of the immunological profile. But I'm definitely in favor that prior exposure to coronaviruses could actually be beneficial for fighting off the infection. And this is maybe a reason why some people are taking this infection really easily, whereas others are, taking it really, really bad. So it's exciting in a sense that we can in fact figure out what antibodies these people have, and try to use it for therapeutic reasons as well, and kind of copy paste what nature has already done for us.
All right, guys. So you just mentioned that some people are having harsh
Can you
reactions.
take this comment off my face? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So Jack, Dr. Jack, you just mentioned that some people are obviously this is very serious. People are dying, and then some people just barely have any reaction, if that. I mean, from what I understood, about 50% of people are asymptomatic. Asymptomatic means that they have no symptoms. Basically, they're not even sick. And the rest, like probably another 30-40%, have very mild illness. So one of the things I want to ask you guys, and I want both of you to weigh in on this. Uh, I think that primary, from a public perspective, the primary fear associated with any illness is death, right? Because at the end of the day, if it's a virus that's going to come and it's going to go, even if it has some kind of long-term repercussions, it has some long-term effects on your body. Well, I mean, it's life, right? We don't go through life being unscathed. There's a lot of stuff that we're all, like I said last time, it's part of death is a part of life. It's but at the end of the day, I mean, this is what I want to get at the 150, 160,000 deaths that have been attributed to coronavirus in this country. Okay, a lot of us are hearing that the vast majority of these people had underlying comorbidities. They were older. How accurate is that number? I mean, should we really believe that 150, 160,000 people died from coronavirus? Was coronavirus the reason why 160,000 people died in this country? And I want to start this off with Dr. George's response.
I think so. I've heard people say this stuff, like even from patients that is you're telling me I have coronavirus so you can bill more or whatever it is. That those are all overblown. But the way let me just back up just to one thing to answer your question. When there's a death certificate, people who don't know, when you fill out a death certificate, the way it's worded is patient died from immediate cause, proximal cause. So, for example, you fell down the stairs, you broke your leg, you wound up in the hospital, and you were laid up, and you got a pulmonary embolus, and you died. So, what killed you? Was it the pulmonary embolus? But was it falling down the steps? So these things get included in the kind of like a stepwise manner, and that's how we think about death when we write it. So that's why if you look at it from the outside, you may see a COVID-19 may be included in the file as a diagnosis for somebody who came in. It doesn't mean they, maybe they didn't die from it, but they had it. So to answer your question, Lev, I think the absolute number of people dying from coronavirus, that 150,000, is definitely an overshoot. I don't think it's like 100,000 over, maybe 20,000 over, or 15,000. I mean, I don't know what to say. But the way to think about it, the most reliable way, I think, is in these smaller studies. For example, the cruise ships and smaller controlled not controlled outbreaks, but outbreaks where we have data on everybody and we can estimate, or we have estimates on the number of people who got sick, got hospitalized, and died. Those numbers seem to gel. They seem to match from one location to another from time to time, all kind of condensing or whatever around a case fatality rate of about 0.7, 0.8%. That seems it's repeatable. We're seeing it in completely different unrelated areas. So I think that's the best way to go. And just to say one last thing, actually the best way to think about that percentage that I told you, let's just assume it's 0.8%. I think the best way to think about it is to work backwards. Just say, okay, if the number of deaths we have, let's say, is 150,000, let's take off 15%, maybe 20% that were not directly, related to COVID. That'll leave us, I don't know, let's just say 120,000, and that's 0.8%. Then multiply that backwards by by basically 100 times, and that I think will give you a fairly reasonable estimate of how much coronavirus there is out there that hasn't been diagnosed yet or caught yet, because we know the relationship between case and mortality is fairly consistent. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay.
If that makes sense, I
Jack?
don't know.
A very nice summary there, George. A couple of things I want to add is that there was again this study from Italy that came out looking at 64,000 people, right, during the months of April through May, I think. So for a couple of months, they looked at during the peak of their pandemic, what various different things, and from that they looked at mortality and they did a calculation of what's called IFR, which means infection related death. That's where you could say the person had corona and the person died, right? Because sometimes you could say, well, the person died, but did they have corona? That's speculative. But in these cases, they actually measured the number, and the number, the percent that they ended up calculating was that 1.7%, which means at 1.7% of the time that you get infected and have the infection, there's a chance of you dying, right? So we can, if we do large enough sort of testing of how many people have the coronavirus, we could then calculate from that what percent we expect them to die, right? And the other thing is the other kinds of studies that I want to add are the excessive death studies, where they look at the number of people that have died during a span of over some period, and they compare it to today, this under the pandemic situation. And looking at this excessive death data, we are definitely seeing higher numbers of people dying.
No,
Now,
actually, there's data from the CDC just recently that shows the excessive mortality is down in all groups except for the oldest age. I think it was 75 and above. I just looked at that data today, actually.
because but excessive debt on average is higher. I mean,
Lower.
part of the reason is people are not driving, so you could say, well, they're not having as many car accidents, so they're not dying as much. And there's also people that are dying at home from COVID that we're not diagnosing them as having. So with all of these sort of nuances and guesstimates that could
Jack,
be
do we
off here
really
and there,
I don't think
although
that's true.
do we really think people are dying at home from COVID? I mean,
yeah,
given the
people
reality,
No,
could get
no,
people
no,
could
no.
get a heart attack or a stroke or pulmonary embolism
I would say
and die
people
from it.
are
Why
dying of
would
other
how would you
things
know
at home.
it's how would you know it's COVID? You're not going to do an autopsy. You don't test for dead people in COVID.
I don't think there's a huge population of people who are in this day of with the pandemic who are short of breath, fevers, sick, and they just sit at home and die instead of going to the hospital.
Well, we're seeing a lot
It
of
happens, but
strokes.
I think it's very rare. I don't think.
We're seeing a drop in stroke patients, for example, in our hospitals, right? People are just not going into the hospital. And I'm not saying that I mean, people are getting cured from stroke better. I just think people are scared to go to the hospital and die at home from a stroke or a heart attack. And there was just a study in JAMA that looked at in-home hospital deaths from cardiac related issues. I believe it was out of Italy, and they saw a significant rise in those numbers, people dying from cardiac arrest at home and not wanting to go to the hospital. So I could
All right,
see that
guys.
totally. But on average, I think like George said, give or take 10, 15,000, I think the number and the ballpark of where we are right now, of what the CDC reports, the deaths, I would say it's pretty close.
Can I ask one last question, Mr. Moderator? Directly to Jack. Where do you think this virus came from? What in just like a sentence or two? Do you think it was manufactured? Do you think it was a natural, like a coincidental sort of event, or something nefarious? What's your theory on it?
My theory is based on a couple of Nature papers that have come out that looked at genetic history and compared it to other coronaviruses in bats. And there was at some point an idea that the intermediate species was a pangolin, which I'm not sure it's panned out or not. But looking at the history, and there was another one that recently came out where they were able to do like molecular clock testing, and they showed that this virus had been mutating in bats for a really long time, and eventually acquired a mutation that allowed it to hop into a human, and therefore it was able to start colonizing humans. Now, I could also say that there were people working on this, whether for nefarious reasons or for the sheer fact that we need to be working on these viruses because pandemics like this could happen, right? And people have been calling for more research into this because it's expected that once it hops into a human, it could do a lot of danger. So could people have been working on it and it accidentally escaped the lab from somebody being not careful and walking out with this contagious virus on them? Possible, but I don't think it was done intentionally. Now, the only thing arguing about natural development is the fact that the virus has such a great affinity for the receptor that it binds to. It's almost remarkable that it was able to fine tune it and be able to do it that way, the way it is. Now, did some people purposely make it so that they could then study it within a human cell line and humans? Potentially, but I also don't want to underestimate nature's ability to evolve and be able to find ways to expand. So,
What do you think, Dr. George?
I agree with Dr. Jack over here. I was a little more skeptical, but good job, Jab. You really looks like you've kept upon it. Those two Nature papers that came out did a really good job, especially the second one. And they went back and they really looked at the evolution of the virus, the spike protein, and it looks like a nice straight flat line, like it's continuous. There's no jumps. When you manufacture something, introduce something, you'll see a big, it's kind of like when we're talking, we have a timer running at the bottom of the screen. It's always running. There's no gaps in it. So personally, I think so far it looks consistent with just we call it a zoonotic event. That's what Ebola is. There's lots of infections that do this. Yeah.
I want to take a couple questions from the people that are watching.
Yeah.
Earlier, when we talked about schools and children transmitting this virus, one of our viewers, Mr. Armand Martin, asks, "How do we know that adults did not transmit the disease to the children?" And also, note the difference between transmission rates for children under 10 and those over 10 in general. So, two different questions. When we talk about there's been studies.
I can quickly answer that because we're running out of time. The reason they know the direction of transfer is because they did contact tracing and they figured out who was symptomatic before. So the kid was symptomatic, for example, before the dad, or the dad was, symptomatic before the kid. So they really have to dig down. And in those studies, Armen, the French studies, all these they're really, so for one case, they ended up testing and interviewing something like 1,500 people. They really, anybody that person had contact with. Which second question? Go ahead. You answered the second question, Jack.
No. What I wanted to point out is that the contact tracing is a lot of work, right? It's a lot of manpower. It's a lot of work. So this is why I feel like we need to be prepared and be able to do this at all levels. And I don't think we are there yet as a nation. So this is my biggest concern.
So I'm gonna give this question to both of you guys and ask you to do it and give you a response in, let's say, 3 minutes, because I don't want to cut you off. If you want to get into it, but 3 minutes each. And I'm going to start with Dr. Jack. What we're concerned about as the public is, how do we get out of this? Okay, what is a viable plan, in your opinion, to get us back to normalcy? And I'm going to keep you guys to 3 minutes so that we can then wrap it up. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Jack.
I think we need to learn to live with the virus and create a normalcy that is as close to possible. I think we need to maintain the use of masks. People need to get used to having masks. I mean, certain Asian countries have been doing this for a long period of time, and it's part of their culture, right? And in fact, wearing masks is not just good for the coronavirus and preventing the pandemic from really getting out of hand in certain areas. It's also good for preventing the flu, right? We're gonna get to the flu season really quickly, and it could be useful for this and many other infections. So learning to deal with having masks on and making that a normal part of life is important. Learning to wash our hands and our hygienes is very, very important. And the other thing is social distancing for the time period until we can have a handle on the virus needs to happen. People need to be more responsible. People need to be more mindful. I don't want people to be scared, afraid that this is the Ebola and it's going to kill him. And like I've been saying from the very beginning, people should not be feared. They should not be scared. They should be mindful and they should be careful. Do the things that you're recommended. We're not asking you to get a heart transplant. The recommendations are things that people could do. And, putting on pants before you go outside could seem like a drag on a weekend, but this is what society and culture wants you to do. You can't be running out naked, right? So putting on a mask could be considered something like that. and we need to have more respect for one another. Just because you're young and healthy and saying that I don't care, nothing is going to happen to me, which isn't necessarily true, but let's assume that for the time being. Learning to respect the elderly of other people, even if you don't have one in your own household, putting that mask on, doing it the right way, and respecting each other as a human, I think is the way to get out of this situation until we have a more real solution, which I think would be the introduction of vaccines and generating enough immunity in the population where we could slowly start to turn the um, screws off on some of these other measures that we're doing. So
All right, Jack. Since you still have 45 seconds, quick question for you.
I'll give it to George
When do you
to.
think? No, quick question. When are we going to have vaccines?
I've been saying this from for a long time now, based on everything I've read. I think Santa on Christmas, around Christmas, will deliver us a vaccine that we could start using it. Now, how quickly that would be mass produced and tested and be able and for everybody to have access to will depend on the country and the circumstances. But I think starting end of December around Christmas is when we'll have it.
Okay, thanks, Jack. So, same question to you, Dr. George. From your expert opinion, what do we need to do from a public health perspective to get out of this crisis so that we can get back to normalcy?
Here's my prediction, and everybody out there, mark my words. This is what I think is going to happen. We're not this coronavirus isn't going to be something that is going to mark our system. We're not going to live with this for years to come. People get coronavirus once. You only get it once. You can't get it twice. This virus has not shown any evidence of mutating the way, like for example, influenza does year to year, where it's constantly evading. So people get it once. I think what's gonna happen is we're gonna come up ultimately. And by the way, let me say one more thing. We have history and
time. You have plenty of time.
We have experience with other infections that are much more infectious and viral. For example, measles. Measles was horrendous, much more dangerous than this, and much more infectious. Anyway, people don't get coronavirus twice. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to go through maybe two waves or maybe 3 waves of vaccines. The first one may not hit it on the mark, but we'll be able to nail this. I think maybe by the end of next year, where it's not going to come. I don't think it's going to be an issue where we just walk around and worry about it for the rest of our lives. But I think the issue of wearing masks. I think we're the days of just walking around and shaking hands with people you don't know are probably going to be different. So to answer your question more specifically, what can we do? What should we do to get through this? Other than giving it time, I think that we should, in a very controlled manner, open up and begin to reintegrate our economy. The economy has to pick up and we have to move forward. We could pick up the pieces and we can, people I think are in this fear mode where you think you just sit at home and close the doors and just let this pass, but that only puts it on hold. I think we have to move forward slowly with, cautiously. We can put our finger on it. We can still, something happens, we can react to it. So that's what I think the outcome is going to be, or that's the best way to get through it. For sure, flattening the curve is not the same as beating the pandemic. Those are two different things, and I think they've become conflated.
Yeah.
By the way, guys, have we flattened the curve? Have we succeeded in flattening the curve?
Yeah.
Say that again?
Have we succeeded in flattening the curve?
Oh yeah, we definitely flattened.
I would agree with
originally,
that.
that was the whole intention, right? If I'm not mistaken, that was the original intention for the shutdown.
We definitely flattened the curve, but now,
But then what
For the most part. Say that again, Levon. Sorry.
So, just real quick, what explains in your guys' mind if the original intention was to flatten the curve, and I have 2 experts here telling me that we have successfully flattened the curve. Why are we continuing this, semi-lockdown, shutdown mode?
Well, a little bit is because of this. It's the same thing I think with the stock. If somebody looks at a stock market, you don't know how badly it's going to peak. So it shot up, and the worry is that it's just going to overwhelm the system. So there's always no penalty for people to be, on people, the elites, the politicians or whoever else. There's no penalty for them to be overly conservative and say, everybody shut down everything. but if they'll always be blamed if something bad happens. So I think part of it's partly natural, but I think that's part of the reason.
Well, I
You
mean,
don't
what
want to
I
be
heard
cause of anybody's
is,
death.
I'm sorry?
You don't want to be responsible for making a decision that ends up costing people's lives, because morally and on your conscience, that's going to be bad. So if there are certain parts of the country not too long ago where their curve was starting to look really bad. And I was hearing that they were running out of ICU beds and they were having trucks ready to load up dead bodies. So, and again, I don't think we need to make this a national thing, because it could have situations in certain parts of the country that go up and down, like the stock market, George was saying. So we need to make this decisions on, I think, even on a lower than state level, maybe even district level of how much to open the economy, how much to pull it back. So
If you ask me, I think the answers are all going to come by looking at what other countries have gone through and learning from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. The pandemic started early in other places well before us, so we
but
have the
George, we
benefit
can.
of that
Hey
experience.
guys, I know I said last question, but let's wrap it up on this really last question, and you guys can have closing remarks because you brought this up as a very good point. What do you think, both professionally, from your perspective, how well has the United States done compared to other countries in responding to this pandemic?
Me?
I'll let George start off with
Both
that.
of you guys, just real
Yeah.
briefly.
I think we've done remarkably well. I think we've done remarkably given the complexity, the size of the population, the amount of testing that we've implemented. I think we've done remarkably well. Um, yeah.
So, how about you, Jack?
I think our testing could actually need some work. The rapid testing, of course, we're bigger than most countries. I
But
think the one thing we did wrong. I mean, one thing we did right was shut down our borders pretty quickly, which most countries did not, and that was, I think, a good decision to
Do you
contain.
think that saved lives? Do you guys, because the President Trump touts that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Do you guys agree that had we not closed the borders when we did, that we would have had a lot
We
more?
could have had
naturally,
more seating. Yeah, we
naturally,
could have.
and I'll say this to answer your question, Levon. If I was on any country on the planet right now and I had COVID, I would want to be here because I know what we have in our hospitals. We have remdesivir. We have excellent ventilators. We have steroids. We have top level medical care. That's really what separates living and dying from this infection is the things that we have here. So
And the
for
trained
sure.
personnel, I think.
And the trained personnel, yeah, people knock down America, but I think we have to remember that we're actually. I would send my own family. I'd say the only place I would want them to be is in a hospital in the United States right now if they got sick.
And again, not because I think we're both trained in America. I just think we have some of the best education system. And what gets you out of an ICU is how good the ICU docs are. I mean, there's no question about that. And I give my colleagues the utmost credit for being able to do the heroic stuff that they do,
I talked
especially
to.
in the beginning where we had no clue of what was going on. The struggles to figure this out was all, again, Italian colleagues gave us a lot of information, but what we did here and what that information expanded to the rest of the world, there's no question about it.
All right. So just 30 seconds, real closing remarks for each of you guys. I'll start with Dr. George.
I really don't have any closing remarks. Jack, Dr. Jack, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Jack, you're a resident, is that correct?
Yeah.
You're one of the most well-read residents I think I've ever met. Congratulations! I'm really proud of you. I mean, I feel like I'm an older brother to you because
Appreciate that.
you're younger. I wish you're going to be a very successful. You already are a very successful person. But it's been a pleasure talking with you, and thanks to Levon for moderating this event. And thank you, Jack, for bringing the public's getting the public involved in this and talking about it.
Jack?
Dr. George, I really appreciate your comments. I want to thank you again for agreeing to be on here. I've learned a lot just discussing with you, even off the air, let's just say, the stuff we've had, the debates. And it's truly a pleasure to have somebody like yourself to be able to, the ins and outs of infectious disease and epidemiology. And yes, I look for you as my older, let's just say, sibling that doesn't beat me up. So I appreciate that. And again, Levon, thanks for combining us together and
My
giving us
pleasure,
this
man.
opportunity.
My pleasure. Yeah, I did make
Yeah.
the introduction between you two, so I'll take credit for that. And it was a pleasure sitting between you guys.
Okay.
Yeah, and an awesome job of moderating and asking pertinent questions. So I want to thank all of you guys and the audience and everybody else. Stay safe and be healthy.
Okay. Good night.
Good night, everyone.